History tells that in the 16th century, the great Inca Empire fled from the ferocious onslaught of Spanish conquistadors. Somewhere deep inside the jungles of Peru, the Incas built a last stronghold. There, they made their final stand against their ruthless enemy. But with their death, the memory of where this last refuge was disappeared. But one man was determined to find it. An American explorer named Hiram Bingham.
He was Indiana Jones. He was 6'4", he looked like a Hollywood idol. He was a man obsessed with his mission.
Bingham was a tough explorer. No Andean mountain seems to have been too high for him, no jungle too dense.
And he did find an extraordinary Inca city. Machu Picchu. It was hailed as the lost city in the clouds. A spiritual Inca refuge, perching high on top of a skyscraping mountain. Bingham was convinced he had found the long-lost city of the Incas, their final refuge from the Spanish conquest. But all was not as it seemed. In 1911, there was a young scholar specializing in modern Latin American history at Yale University, USA, Hiram Bingham. But he was no impoverished academic. Bingham was 36 years old, married to Alfreda Mitchell, an heiress to the Tiffany Diamond Empire. They had 6 young sons and lived in a 30-roomed mansion on top of a hill. He was a man who seemed to have all the comforts of life. But Bingham was restless and driven.
Hiram Bingham had a really compulsive need to become famous, and I think that's because of his family.
He was Hiram Bingham III, and I think that's incredibly important because his grandfather, Hiram Bingham I, he was a very powerful, impressive missionary character, and so was his father, Hiram Bingham II. So there's this legacy, this weight on his shoulders that he had to prove himself or do something with his life at the very least.
What that something could be, he had absolutely no idea. To secure a permanent position at Yale University, Bingham went to Peru in 1909 to study the Spanish trade routes between Buenos Aires and Lima. During the journey, he was invited by his guide to see an ancient Inca site high up in the Andes Mountains. It was an event that would change his life.
It was my first introduction to prehistoric American history. I agreed, not knowing that it was going to lead me into a fascinating field.
Bingham is taken to this remote Inca ruin called Choqquequirao, which means cradle of gold, and is immediately struck by the romance of the position.
The Inca ruins lay 10,000 feet above sea level, and the climb was astounding, with breathtaking views of the distant snow-capped mountains and the roar of the Apurimac River below. It was also exhilarating.
At times, the trail was so steep that it was easier to go on all fours than to attempt to walk erect. Most of the time, we were hanging on to the side of the mountain almost by our eyelids.
On the way up, they saw amazing sights, including a huge condor that sailed down to take a look at them.
We could not only see his cruel beak and great talons, but even the whites of his eyes. It was an awe-inspiring moment.
Bingham was a tough explorer. No Andean mountain seems to have been too high for him, no jungle too dense.
Eventually, they reached the Inca ruins on the flattened peak. For Bingham, it was a magical experience. Choqquequirao was built in the 15th century and was believed to be a sacred Inca dwelling and one of their frontier fortresses. It was designed to defend the approaches to their great capital city, Cusco. Bingham wrote to his wife Alfreda to tell her it was the most interesting place he had ever seen.
He's amazingly impressed by the remains of Inca architecture because he'd never known about this before. He'd heard of the Incas, but he didn't know that what they'd achieved was quite as impressive as this. Some people see this as a sort of epiphany, you know, this really changes the direction of his life.
Till now, Bingham's knowledge of South American history was limited to the Spanish colonial days, and he knew very little about the Incas. As he looked out to the distant mountains, Bingham was keen to find out more about them. Who were these people who built this extraordinary place? What was their story?
Those snow-capped peaks in an unknown and unexplored part of Peru fascinated me greatly. They tempted me to go see what lay beyond.
And he thought of this line from Kipling.
Something hidden. Go and find it. Go and look behind the ranges.
You get this feeling that this worked on him, on his imagination, that somewhere just beyond the range was a city, a world, a reputation to be found.
Back in the Yale library, Bingham began researching the Inca history. He opened the pages of the Spanish Chronicles, a key source on Spain's golden age of discovery, conquest, and colonization of the Americas.
He began reading more about the Incas. And of course, even as a non-academic, the story of the conquistadors and the Incas is incredibly exciting.
Bingham learned how from the early 13th century to the middle to late 16th century, the Incas were the most powerful empire in the Americas. Their domain stretched over 2,000 miles, from modern-day Chile to the Amazon. But then came catastrophe. In 1532, the Spanish conquistadors, headed by their ruthless leader, Francisco Pizarro, entered the Inca heartland. He was hell-bent on their destruction. Over the next 40 years, the Spaniards drove the Indians from their cities and slaughtered them in their thousands.
Bingham really is intrigued by the history of the last Incas and what they'd done after the Spaniards arrived.
Bingham's eyes were drawn to an account where a young Inca emperor named Manco had led his people as they fled their capital city, Cusco, in 1536. Manco managed to escape the Spanish and created a new Inca capital called Vitcos, 10,000 feet above sea level, somewhere in the remote mountainous region of the Vilcabamba Valley. But the Spanish conquistadors were in hot pursuit. and the Incas fled again. This time, the chronicles said, they went down from their mountain homes into the Amazon lowland. There, protected by a dense jungle in the largest rainforest in the world, they built a new city called Vilcabamba. And it was here that the Incas made their last stand. But it was all to no avail. In 1572, the Spaniards finally defeated the Incas. And so with their death, their last refuge, Vilcabamba, disappeared from history. Bingham was transfixed by the story of Vilcabamba. But for all the references of the city, there was one vital clue missing.
Nobody, as far as he could see, knew where it was. This appealed to Bingham as a puzzle he could solve himself.
Bingham tried to work out where Vilcabamba could be. The Spanish chronicles said it lay 30 miles and 2 long days' journey from Vitkos. But he had no idea even where Vitkos was. Continuing his studies, he found another clue. The chronicles said that Vitkos was 100 miles northwest of Cusco, along the Urubamba Valley in the Andes mountain range. Bingham knew where Cusco was. He had visited it on his last trip to South America. But if no one knew where Vitkos was, how would he know when he'd reached it? There was a further clue in the Spanish accounts. They said that there was a sacred area with a large white rock close by the city. So if Bingham could locate the white rock, he would know he had found Vitkos. Now Bingham realized that if he could find Vitkos, then 2 days beyond it, he should be able to find Vilcabamba. This, Bingham thought, would be how he could make his name. He would lead an expedition to find the Incas' last refuge, Vilcabamba. Bingham began to form his team.
He needed to be funded to take an expedition down there, particularly then. It was an expensive business.
The first thing Bingham did was approach a number of corporations. Businesses specializing in America's outdoor country pursuits offered their support. Abercrombie & Fitch supplied Bingham with an explorer's outfit.
He managed to get Winchester to give him a rifle, Kodak to give a camera, and then he turned to his classmates.
Bingham estimated that he would need 6 expedition members, and that each one would require $1,800 to cover their travel and food expenses. One former classmate heard about his plans and offered him $1,800 if he would take a Yale geologist with him. Bingham snapped up the offer. Others came forward. One was a topographer. Another, a mountain climbing engineer. Eventually, Bingham got together a multidisciplinary team.
So he's got a doctor, a naturalist, geologist, a couple of topographers. So it's a pretty good, well-rounded, versatile team.
To pay his own way, Bingham promised to write 4 articles for the fashionable Harper's magazine. But he was still $1,800 short. Only now did he turn to the one source he could rely on, his wife Alfreda, to tap the Tiffany fortune. She agreed. Bingham's party left New York for Peru on the 8th of June, 1911. Their destination? The former Inca capital city, Cusco. This, Bingham knew, lay near the Urubamba Valley in the Andes mountain range and would be his starting off point. Bingham's expedition arrived in Cusco on the 2nd of July, 1911. His aim was to first locate the sacred white rock at Vitkos, then to make his way down from the mountains into the lowland Amazon jungle to search for Vilcabamba. Bingham and his best friend, a naturalist named Harry Foote, set out on the morning of the 19th of July 1911 on their quest for where they believed Vilcabamba could be. The rest of the party were dispatched to carry out geological and mapping surveys of the Andes.
So they head off across the high-altitude lands, then descend into the Urubamba Valley itself. And the Urubamba is the famous sacred valley of the Incas, and follow the river along, sort of heading generally in the direction northwest.
Bingham kept a meticulous diary of his expedition. Today, it is regarded as one of the greatest first-hand accounts in the history of exploration.
I had entered the marvelous canyon of the Urubamba. Here the river runs through gigantic mountains of granite. I know of nowhere in the world that can compare with it.
Bingham writes in the most compulsive way. He's someone with academic authority, and yet he knows how to tell a good story.
Not only does it have great snow peaks looming above the clouds more than 2 miles overhead, it also has, in striking contrast, orchids and tree ferns, and the mysterious witchery of the jungle.
He paints pictures with words, and not just of visual things, but of the heart, you know, the spirit, what you're feeling.
One is drawn irresistibly onward by ever-recurring surprises, through a deep and winding gorge, turning and twisting past overhanging cliffs of incredible height.
He's still got a little way to go before he gets to this area where he thinks he's going to find Vitkos, the old Inca capital. So he's sort of working himself in, working the team in.
On the evening of the 23rd of July 1911, after a 70-mile journey from Cusco and 3/4 of the way to where Vitkos is said to be, Bingham and Foote set up camp for the night in a canyon surrounded by steep mountains.
They camp at a place called Mandor Pampa, and they meet a man there called Melchor Arteaga, and he questions him. He says, you know, are there ruins around here?
Arteaga told Bingham there were some fine ones on top of the opposite mountain called Huayna Picchu, and also on a ridge called Machu Picchu, or Old Peak.
People in Peru were always telling him that if he gave them a bit of money, they could lead him to a ruin. And there was a little bit of sort of won't get fooled again feeling in his team.
They had heard ruins were around many times, and they'd gone, it would be one little house or a couple of things.
And this is where I think we have to give a lot of credit to Bingham, because lesser men would have said, oh, for God's sake, there's not supposed to be anything up that hill. There's nothing in the history books. This is just a wild goose chase.
Bingham noted the ruins' names in his pocket diary and arranged for Arteaga to take him there the following day. The morning of the 24th of July, 1911, dawned with a cold rain. Bingham prepared for his climb up Machu Picchu. His best friend, Harry Foote, didn't fancy the wet conditions.
The naturalist said there were more butterflies near the river. Anyway, it was my job to investigate. Arteaga shivered. He said it was too hard to climb for such a wet day. But when he found out that I was willing to pay him 3 or 4 times the ordinary daily wage, he finally agreed to go.
Arteaga and Bingham left the camp at 10 a.m.
After a walk of about 3/4 of an hour, Arteaga left the main road and plunged down through the bank of the river. Here there was a primitive bridge which crossed the roaring rapids. It was obvious that no one could live for an instant in the icy cold rapids, but would immediately be dashed to pieces against the rocks.
He said, I admit freely, I was on my hands and knees going really, really slowly across. And all I could think of was, I hope the water doesn't go up because it'll just take the bridge away.
After the river came the mountain.
Leaving the stream, we now struggled up the bank through dense jungle. And in a few minutes, reached the bottom of a very precipitous slope. For an hour and 20 minutes, we had a hard climb. A good part of the distance, we went on all fours, sometimes holding on by our fingernails.
Bingham was now climbing at nearly 8,000 feet.
Bingham was going up through very difficult cloud forest. Conditions were humid, it was hard work.
Shortly after noon, just as we were completely exhausted, we reached several good-natured Indians who were pleasantly surprised by our unexpected arrival. It seemed that these Indians had chosen this eagle's nest for their home.
A small boy named Pablo Richate was sent on to guide Bingham around the ruins.
He's led by this little boy around a corner, and he sees something quite extraordinary.
Hardly had we left and rounded the promontory, then we were confronted with an unexpected sight. A great flight of beautifully constructed stone-faced terraces, perhaps 100 of them, each hundreds of feet long and 10 feet high. They had recently been rescued from the jungle by the Indians.
It is an amazingly evocative description of firstly going through what were lovely Inca terraces, Bingham says, and then slowly things build.
From the cleared stonework, he was introduced to another spectacular sight.
Suddenly, without warning, under a huge overhanging ledge, the boy showed me a cave beautifully lined with the finest cut stone.
And then he's going from one wonder to another.
It had evidently been a royal mausoleum. On top of this particular ledge was a semicircular building whose outer wall, gently sloping and slightly curved, bore a striking resemblance to the famous Temple of the Sun in Cusco. Clearly, it was the work of a master artist.
Then there's the temple with the rounded wall, and then cumulatively, the overall effect.
Bingham was stunned by its magnificence and realized that this wasn't just some little Inca settlement he has come to see.
It seemed like an unbelievable dream. Dimly, I began to realize that this wall and its adjoining semicircular temple over the cave were as fine as the finest stonework in the world. It fairly took my breath away. What could this place be? Why had no one given us any idea of it? Surprise followed surprise in bewildering succession. Suddenly we found ourselves standing in front of the ruins of two of the finest and most interesting structures in ancient America.
There are cyclopean stones, as he calls them. Stones the height of a human, but beautifully worked with a very, very fine granite.
On the east side of the plaza was another amazing structure, the ruins of a temple containing 3 great windows looking out over the canyon to the rising sun. Like its neighbor, it is unique among Inca ruins.
Bingham had made an extraordinary discovery. It seemed almost too good to be true.
Would anyone believe what I had found? Fortunately, in this land where accuracy in reporting what one has seen is not a prevailing characteristic of travelers, I had a good camera, and the sun was shining.
I know that he had a very special Kodak camera that was made for traveling in rugged territory, and the negatives are huge. So the resolution, you know, the detail is really fantastic.
But one question puzzled Bingham. Where was he?
Now, Bingham was not really looking for a ruin in this part of the world, so he couldn't make sense of what he'd found.
Machu Picchu laid 70 miles from Cusco, so it couldn't be Vitcos, which was said to be 100 miles from Cusco. And it couldn't be the Incas' last refuge, Vilcabamba. because that was said to be 30 miles on from Vitkos, down on the jungle plains. So what was this astonishing place? Suddenly, Bingham's eye focused on some charcoaled graffiti on a rock of the three-windowed temple. Lizarraga, 1902. His blood ran cold.
Bingham was a man who wanted to make a name for himself, and he was pulled up short. He suddenly saw this graffiti. Had some scholar got there first?
Bingham wrote the name Lizarraga 1902 in his diary and prayed it wasn't another explorer.
Maybe he'd been picked to the post. Maybe this wasn't really a discovery at all.
Deeply worried, Bingham made his way back down the mountain. He hardly mentioned the Machu Picchu ruins when he returned to the campsite below. In fact, his best friend, Harry Foote, wrote in his diary, no special things to note. Bingham discreetly asked Arteaga about the Lizarraga 1902 graffiti. Arteaga told Bingham, Augustin Lizarraga is the discoverer of Machu Picchu. He lives at San Miguel Bridge, just downstream of your campsite.
And at that point, Hiram Bingham must have sighed and thought, oh, that is that. And he actually writes it in his diary. Lizarraga is the discoverer. And his heart must have sunk.
Bingham was horrified and set off to find the mysterious Lizarraga. But when he got to San Miguel Bridge, Augustin Lizarraga was not at home. So Bingham spoke to his brother, Angel. Angel told him that the ruins were known in the valley and parts of it were cultivated by farmers. His brother was one of those farmers. Bingham relaxed. Lizarraga wasn't a rival academic after all. He was just a local Peruvian peasant. Bingham's discovery of Machu Picchu was secure. The very next day, he set off on another long journey to search for the last refuge of the Incas, Vilcabamba. But first, he had to locate the White Rock at Vitkos. Bingham followed the information detailed in the Spanish chronicles he had read back at Yale. He asked every local they passed if they knew the whereabouts of any ruins in the area, and paid local guides to lead him onwards.
He carries on down the valley into even more uncharted territory. He's put the whole thing of Machu Picchu to one side.
"15 days after encountering the ruins of Machu Picchu, Bingham came across the sacred White Rock, mentioned in the chronicles as being close to the Incas' capital city, Vitkos.
It was late on the afternoon of August 9th, 1911, when I first saw this remarkable shrine. We could now be fairly sure that we had located one of Manco's capitals, Vitkos.
If Bingham had found the ruins of the former Inca city, Vitkos, it meant that he had to be on the right track. and close to completing his objective, finding their last refuge, Vilcabamba. The Chronicle said it was a long 2-day journey from Vitkos.
By now, Bingham's blood is up. I mean, he realized that these ruins are toppling over like 9 pins. You know, he's found Machu Picchu, he's found Vitkos, and there's one final place he wants to find, which is a place where the Inca emperor and the exiles escaped to if the Spanish ever came looking for them.
Bingham came down from the mountains into the huge lowland jungles of the Amazon. This was now a very different world to the ethereal mountaintops of Machu Picchu. It was a place that even the local Peruvians feared, like the Spanish conquistadors before them.
One of our informants said the Inca city was called Espiritu Pampa, or the Plain of the Ghosts, to be reached only by a hard trail passable for barefooted savages, but scarcely available for us unless we chose to go on our hands and knees.
Finally, after several days traveling, Bingham found, beneath the thick twines of a rainforest jungle, evidence of some ruins. To his excitement, the locals called it Espiritu Pampa. Even better, they also called it Vilcabamba. Surely, Bingham had found the last refuge of the Incas. But as he set to work, he came across something very puzzling. The few buildings he had found were clearly Inca, but their stonework was rough and inferior. Bingham searched for more extensive ruins, but failed to find anything substantial. Bingham wrote in his diary,
After several days digging, ruins well scattered, long hard job to clear ruins, hardly worthwhile.
The more Bingham dug, the more he became convinced that the site just wasn't special enough to be Vilcabamba. But if this wasn't the place where the Incas had their last refuge, then where was it? Slowly, Bingham started to reconsider the evidence. He went back to the Spanish chronicles. They told him that Vilcabamba was the largest city in the province. Machu Picchu was clearly much bigger than anything he had found in the jungle. Then there was the puzzling issue of the inferior architecture. Nothing he saw in the Amazon matched the finely cut stone at Machu Picchu. Bingham also wondered about something else. Would the Incas, who are highland people, have really made a home down in the flatland jungle?
It does not seem reasonable that such people would have cared to live in the hot valley of Espiritu Pampa. These Inca ruins are unique in lying so low in the Amazon jungle. The difference in climate is as great as that between Scotland and Egypt. Furthermore, they could have found the seclusion and safety which they craved just as well in several other parts of the province, particularly at Machu Picchu.
Now he began focusing on another issue. The chronicles stated that the city of Vilcabamba lay 2 days' march from Vitkos. So did Machu Picchu, albeit in a different direction.
Machu Picchu was roughly 2 days from Vitkos if you walked across, and he did it. He walked from Vitkos across back to Machu Picchu directly.
An idea slowly began to dawn on him. Could his discovery, Machu Picchu, be the real Vilcabamba? Bingham returned to America at the end of 1911, determined to prove his case.
After Bingham discovered Machu Picchu in 1911, there was very little publicity. Tiny mentions in the New York Times and the Geographical magazine in London, but nothing much.
Bingham revisited Machu Picchu in 1912, increasingly convinced it was Vilcabamba, the last refuge of the Incas. He was now head of a major excavation and clearing program, funded by Yale and the National Geographic Society. Looking over the tangled city, Bingham wrote in his diary,
Machu Picchu ruins as fine as ever. Very impressive.
The material Bingham produced was so impressive that the National Geographic devoted an entire issue of their magazine to his discovery.
The owner of National Geographic magazine said, we're going to make Machu Picchu a star, and moreover, Mr. Bingham, we're going to make you a star as well.
In April 1913, with the cover title, In the Wonderland of Peru, National Geographic published in pictures and text Bingham's amazing account of his finding of Machu Picchu. The news was a global sensation. The public needed little convincing. Finally, it became accepted that Machu Picchu was Vilcabamba, the Incas' final refuge. And Hiram Bingham's name was made. Hiram Bingham would go down in history as one of the all-time great explorers. But there is an irony in this tale. Machu Picchu was an amazing Inca site. However, modern scholars now believe that the ruins at Espiritu Pampa, which Bingham had dismissed in 1911, are far grander and larger than he had realized.
In 1964, some 50 years after Bingham had been there, an American called Gene Savoy, an adventurer and archaeologist, went down to Espiritu Pampa and did a much more thorough clearing of the site and established really beyond doubt that that was indeed the proper last refuge of the Incas, which I think all archaeologists would agree today.
Bingham's initial detective work that had led him to Espiritu Pampa had been on the right trail after all. He had found the real Vilcabamba. He just hadn't realized it. So if Machu Picchu wasn't the last refuge of the Incas, what was it? Today, Machu Picchu is believed to have been built by the Incas during the expansion of their empire in the mid-15th century, 75 years before the Spanish arrived. It was constructed as a royal estate and served as a sacred and seasonal retreat for the Inca rulers whenever the weather was severe in their capital city, Cusco.
Everyone now tends to the view that it was built as a winter palace for an Inca emperor, probably the greatest of them all, Pachacuti. He could come down with his retinue to Machu Picchu, which has a much better climate, and enjoy a fabulous resort-type atmosphere. It was a very exclusive place, which is perhaps why there was no historical record of it. It was a place where an emperor could build his own fantasy creation in the clouds, a sort of Las Vegas, if you like, which, if it didn't have neon billboards, did have this show-off architecture that only an emperor could afford.
Scholars now believe Machu Picchu was abandoned by the Incas long before the Spanish arrived in Peru in 1532. Why they left their great winter retreat, however, remains a mystery. So where does that leave Hiram Bingham today? Was he just an adventurer who allowed his prejudice and emotions to get the better of him? Most would regard that as too harsh. To many explorers, he remains a hero.
Hiram Bingham was the perfect man of the moment. Here was a character with a dream, someone who wished to find treasure, and that is exactly what he did.
He made the discovery both of Machu Picchu and of other very important Inca sites. I think in many ways he is a bit of a hero, and rather more of a hero perhaps than Indiana Jones, because he's real.
He was the first scientific discoverer, the man who took the time, brought money to the enterprise, who exposed Machu Picchu to the world, literally peeling back that forest and showing us what an extraordinary place it was.
I was so happy that he had had the energy and the curiosity and the drive to find Machu Picchu, to rediscover it, to write about it, to make it famous to the whole world so other people could come and really enjoy it.
Despite being wrong about Vilcabamba and Machu Picchu, Hiram Bingham is still regarded as one of the greatest explorers of his age. After all, perhaps, he found one of the great wonders of the modern world.
The sanctuary was lost for centuries because this ridge is in the most inaccessible corner of the most inaccessible section of the Central Andes. No part of the highlands of Peru is better defended by natural bulwarks. A stupendous canyon whose rock is granite and whose precipices are frequently 1,000 feet sheer. Yet here, in a remote part of the canyon, on a narrow ridge flanked by tremendous precipices, a highly civilized people, artistic, inventive, well-organized, and capable of sustained endeavor at some time in the distant past, built themselves a sanctuary for the worship of the sun.
According to legend, in 1819, a group of men bury a fabulous treasure in the Virginia countryside.
Of gold and silver and jewels worth tens of millions of dollars.
Their leader, Thomas Beale, writes down the treasure's location in a secret code. He entrusts an innkeeper with its safekeeping, vowing to return. But then Thomas Beale vanishes.
Not only does Thomas Beale disappear, his whole party disappears. It's a complete mystery.
Years later, two brothers, George and Clayton Hart, take up the challenge of cracking Beale's mysterious code to recover his glittering treasure. During their 50-year quest, they turn to the world's most famous code breakers and even the supernatural.
But when someone is hot on the trail of a treasure, they will use every possible means at their disposal.
In the 19th century, a seance was science. He genuinely believes that mesmerism will uncover the location of this treasure.
Theirs is an extraordinary quest to unravel the mystery of Thomas Beale's lost treasure. The story begins in southern USA in 1897 at the offices of the Norfolk and Western Railroad Company in Roanoke, Virginia. Clayton Hart, a 25-year-old clerk, spent his working day transcribing documents for his employer.
A man like Clayton Hart, his life is rather humdrum and boring, I think. A lot of rote clerical work, and I can imagine that he is looking at the world and saying there must be something more than my workaday existence.
One summer morning, a senior colleague asked Hart to make copies of a document. It was a routine request, but this document was far from ordinary.
Clayton Hart looks at the papers, and they've got sets of numbers on them. There's no context, no clues, no history, nothing. It's just numbers. What are they for? Where does this lead?
Clearly, these numbers are meant to signify something. They can engender that spark of curiosity. I must find out what this means.
Hart's colleague explained that he believed the numbers could reveal the location of an extraordinary treasure. Buried for almost a century under the Virginia soil. As far as he knew, the treasure still lay undiscovered out there somewhere.
This clerk in this big office can just suddenly imagine a completely different world and can imagine an adventure that is seeming to stare him right in the face. So you could see how that would be very exciting, a very exciting prospect, and the opportunity to break out of his humdrum existence.
So Clayton Hart doesn't know at this particular moment, of course, that this is going to be his life's work. He's going to dedicate his entire life to discovering the location of this treasure hoard.
Clayton Hart made his own copies of the numbered pages, and from his family home in Roanoke, began work to decipher the strange and puzzling codes.
The question is, does Clayton Hart have a chance of solving this cipher? He's an amateur, but it's not a big mathematical cipher. There's a trick to it. Maybe he can solve this.
Clayton scoured the code for clues. He tried to identify patterns and establish relationships between the numbers. But after weeks of effort, he had got nowhere. He desperately needed to find a new lead, if he had any hope of getting his hands on the buried treasure.
So if you can't figure out the code, you can at least figure out who was the author of the code. What kind of person was this author?
He begins to speculate that perhaps if he had some biographical information, some knowledge about where they came from, then he could begin to try and unpick these codes.
Hart made inquiries and soon received his first clue. He discovered that a man named James Ward had published a strikingly similar code in a pamphlet printed 12 years earlier in Lynchburg, Virginia.
When Clayton Hart finds out about a pamphlet that was written only a decade before that, very similar sounding to what he's got, he's very excited. He has to go and see it. This is the only real clue he's got that isn't a number.
Hart set out for Lynchburg, 50 miles away to the east. He scoured the city's bookshops for the mysterious pamphlet. Eventually, he found it. A small, 20-page booklet published in 1885 by a James B. Ward.
What he reads is the Beale papers, containing authentic statements regarding the treasure buried in 1819 and 1821 near Beaufort's in Bedford County, Virginia.
On closer inspection, Hart noticed that the pamphlet contained 3 sets of numbers. The same numbers that had been puzzling him for weeks.
You can almost feel his heart start to pound as he recognizes that this is the very same material that he has, which must have convinced him, well, this is too much to be coincidental. There must be something true. This must be true.
What an exciting thing. What's been a set of numbers is now treasure, actual treasure. Could it get any better than that?
Clayton Hart had hit the jackpot. But who was the Beale referred to in the title? And where was the mysterious treasure buried? Hungry for more clues, Clayton Hart read the pamphlet from cover to cover. Its pages contained a tangled story of mystery and intrigue. Hart learned that in 1821, a mystery man was a guest at the Washington Hotel in Lynchburg. He gave his name as Thomas Beale. He entrusted the hotel's proprietor, Robert Morris, with a locked box for safekeeping.
This seems strange to us, but actually this was quite common. At this time, an innkeeper is actually one of the most trustworthy people that you can hand documents to. So many people would hand documents and private possessions to an innkeeper for safekeeping.
Beale then disappeared without a trace. But several months later, Morris the innkeeper received word from his former guest.
It is a letter from St. Louis instructing Morris that if Beale does not return after a certain period of time, 10 years, that Morris is to open this mysterious locked box.
Hart read that Morris waited 23 years before opening the box. Inside, he discovered a stack of papers.
One of which is a letter addressed to him. And in it is this fantastic account of how Thomas Beale came by this vast amount of gold and treasure while he was journeying in the West.
The story goes that in 1817, Beale and a group of companions set out into the West to hunt buffalo. They journeyed from their home in Virginia across country towards the Rocky Mountains of Colorado. Whilst exploring the rugged terrain, some of Beale's men made an amazing discovery.
So he tells the story that as they are hunting these buffalo, they stumble on a gold mine.
The men abandoned the buffalo hunt and began extracting the gleaming ore.
They spend 18 months, the 30 of them, toiling away, pulling out thousands of pounds of gold and silver, and they debate what it is that they want to do with this. How do they want to store it? How do they share it with their families?
Clayton Hart read that Beale and his men had decided to take their wealth back to Virginia. En route, they stopped in St. Louis. There, they traded the ore for gold coins, silver bars, and precious jewels. They then transported their booty back to Virginia in 2 separate trips, one in 1819 and another in 1821. At that time, banks were not considered to be safe, so they stashed their fortune in a top-secret location in Virginia's Blue Ridge Mountains. The pamphlet explained. Beale then encoded the treasure's hidden location in an enciphered message. Hart was captivated. Could this treasure really be buried in the Virginia mountains? Hart read that along with the letter, Morris the innkeeper had found 3 sheets of paper inside the mysterious box. On each was written line after line of what seemed like random numbers. The pamphlet explained that these numbers form 3 enciphered messages written by Beale. Paper 1 contained the exact location of the treasure. Paper 2 was an inventory of the treasure. And paper 3 was a list of to whom the treasure belonged.
This is the moment where it all links together. It's perfect. It's a treasure hunt, and he's on the treasure hunt. It's his treasure.
The question was, could this code be cracked to reveal the treasure's location? Clayton Hart turned the page, searching for more clues. He read that the innkeeper, Morris, spent nearly 20 years trying to crack the codes. But the challenge defeated him. He passed the codes and Beale's letters to an unnamed friend. That friend then wrestled with the problem for years and eventually made a breakthrough on paper 2.
Morris's unnamed friend makes a really good guess that what he's looking at in these ciphers is a dictionary cipher where each number tells you the index of a word in a book or paper or something. And by looking at the first letter of that word, you can decrypt the message. He tries lots of different books. He tries the Declaration of Independence. And wonderfully, marvelously, it comes out.
Starting by consecutively numbering the words of the declaration, the innkeeper's friend began to decode the second paper. He referenced the code's numbers to the first letters of the numbered declaration's words, and amazingly, Beale's cipher began to unravel.
So using the Declaration of Independence and going through these numbers, you might end up with the letters from the beginning, I-H-A-V-E-D-E-P. I have deposited, and then the rest of the message comes out in that way.
The pamphlet contained a full transcription of the decoded second paper. It was as though Thomas Beale was speaking to Clayton Hart from beyond the grave.
I have deposited in the county of Bedford, about 4 miles from Beaufort's, in an excavation or vault, the following articles. The first deposit consisted of 1,014 pounds of gold and 3,812 pounds of silver. The second consisted of 1,907 pounds of gold and 1,288 pounds of silver. Also, jewels obtained in St. Louis and valued at $13,000.
Clayton Hart was overwhelmed. Here, in black and white, was not only evidence that the treasure was real, but also what it was worth. A truly phenomenal sum that today would be worth over $60 million. The pamphlet also included one vital clue to its location, that it was buried underground about 4 miles from a place called Beaufort's Tavern.
So, from the perspective of Clayton Hart, this is wonderful news because it means that the codes can actually be cracked.
Hart was stunned. It then occurred to him, if the Declaration of Independence was the key to the second Beale paper, maybe other well-known published texts could unlock the first paper, the one that contained the precise location of the treasure. He was convinced that he was on the verge of becoming rich beyond his wildest dreams. Hart headed back to Roanoke, keen to test his theory. He enlisted the help of his brother, George, a trainee lawyer with dreams of opening offices in Washington, D.C.
Of the two brothers, he's the more rational, more skeptical of the two. And Clayton tells his brother about what he's found, and his brother becomes interested.
Clayton described his discoveries, and the two brothers began trying to trace the vital keys to the cipher-encoded papers. They began to examine paper 1 that contained the treasure's location.
What the Hart brothers try to do now is they try loads of different books and loads of different strategies with books.
They count words in different ways. Perhaps it's every word, perhaps it's every other word, perhaps you start numbering at the end, perhaps you take the second letter. So they try many different methods of trying to solve paper number 1.
The brothers toiled for weeks, hunting for the key text that would unlock the location of Thomas Beale's treasure.
But there are so many books, and you don't have to start on page 1. You don't have to even start on the first word of a page. You can start anywhere. So where do you start? They try all kinds of things, but nothing really bites, nothing really works.
After weeks of effort, the treasure's location was still locked in the code. It was clear the Harts must attack the puzzle from a different angle. So Clayton suggested a fresh and unconventional approach to their problem. He proposed that they could unlock the treasure's location through the power of mesmerism.
Mesmerism is a 19th century and early 20th century science. By a combination of hypnotism and electrical currents, a subject would be rendered into a state of trance where they could cross over into another realm and they would describe what they were seeing.
During the 1890s, Clayton Hart had witnessed these techniques in practice and had subsequently educated himself in the arts of mesmerism and hypnotism. He was convinced that he could mesmerize a medium and guide them back through time to Bedford County in 1819. The subject would see through the eyes of one of Beale's men and identify the location of the buried treasure.
Clayton Hart is not an irrational man. He genuinely believes that this application of a scientific process of mesmerism will uncover the location of this treasure.
One year later, in early 1898, the brothers agreed to conduct a séance. For this, they required a suitable medium. Clayton enlisted the help of a local 18-year-old man who had shown promise as a clairvoyant and crystal ball reader. George Hart sized him up as mild-mannered and seemingly disinterested in what was about to happen. Clayton began the mesmerism process.
A typical mesmerist will sit an individual down in a chair and lay their hand upon the median nerve on the top of their arm and press hard to make a connection. The subject would then be handed into their other hand a mesmerist's coin, a piece of zinc wound with wire, so something like a battery. Then the mesmerist would rub their hands up and down this person's arm towards their head, sending a spasm through the individual, which would render them unconscious, insensible, and they would cross over into another realm where they would describe their visions.
The Harts could see that the mesmerism process was working as the medium gazed into the crystal ball and, as if transfixed, took on an unfamiliar personality.
He begins to speak like this rough-hewn, backcountry, early 19th century man would have. He's mouthing words through a body and a persona that seems to have really changed into a whole new person from the past.
Believing that the medium was seeing events from the past, Clayton Hart ordered him to journey to Buford's Tavern in November 1819, to the day before the treasure was buried. The medium described that he could see a group of men inside the tavern building. He then followed the man who appeared to be their leader, Thomas Beale, upstairs. According to the medium, Beale placed his saddlebags on the bed and opened one of its pouches. Inside was a fortune in precious jewels.
When he sees the treasure, the boy declares, "I've never seen such a hoard in all my life. It beats any jeweler's show I've ever seen." And the Hart brothers are amazed.
Clayton ordered the medium to go outside the tavern and investigate the party's wagons.
The subject describes looking into the pots that are on these wagons and seeing gold and silver within these pots.
This first-person commentary seems to be just so vivid and so true to them that it provides just another brick in that wall, that foundation that they're building to support this story.
Now convinced that the treasure was real, Clayton Hart focused his medium on identifying its secret location. He ordered him to follow the men's movements the next day when they went out to bury the treasure.
According to the subject in the seance, he is describing that these two men who are out in the woods near Buford's Tavern are digging a hole, and that they are paving it with stones. And on these stones, they are placing pots, placing more stones on top of the pots. And this is matching exactly what is in the Beale papers in terms of what is described about where the treasure has been hidden.
All of a sudden, the medium snapped out of his mesmerized state.
Their mesmerized subject gives them everything they need, except where the treasure is. But he fills out the story so beautifully, so vividly. It's like he was right there with Thomas Beale.
The Hart brothers took stock of what exactly had just occurred.
George is a skeptic, Clayton is a true believer, and they are not sure whether or not this evidence is real evidence or not. The boy has said something. Is it debatable? Is it up for questioning? So they begin to chat with one another about whether or not they should follow this lead.
Then the medium spoke. He told the brothers that he could lead them to the very spot where the treasure was buried.
They think, how can it get any better? And they think, he can lead us to the treasure. The Harts really want this to be true.
In the spring of 1899, George and Clayton Hart headed out into Virginia's Blue Ridge Mountains. Along with their 18-year-old medium, they scrambled through the wooded countryside. They headed for an inn that was once called Buford's Tavern, as the Beale papers had stated that the treasure was buried close by.
They take the subject of the seance, and he's hypnotized again. He then proceeds, hound dog-like, to sniff his way back to the spot where he remembers that this treasure is buried.
The three men tramped 4 miles through overgrown woodland. Suddenly, the medium stopped before darting off into the woods.
He seems to know right where he's going. He jumps across a stream. He goes up a hill, down into an area where there's a little depression in the ground, and he acts as though he can see the treasure. Look, there it is, it's right there.
This had to be the spot where Thomas Beale had buried his legendary treasure. For 6 hours, they shoveled load after load of moist Virginia soil.
They're digging, and digging is hard work, but there's always that hope of treasure that keeps them going. And they're getting tired, they've been at it for several hours, and then it's Clayton's turn, and he digs, and clunk. He hits a stone, a big stone.
Tingling with anticipation, the brothers cleared the dirt from the stone's edges.
Treasure hunters live for a moment like this. They've been working so hard for so long, deciphering the codes, mesmerizing young boys, and what they end up finding is a hollow stone, and they think, wow, this is my moment. This is the moment where we're going to uncover Thomas Beale's treasure.
But there was nothing underneath. Frustrated, Clayton asked the medium if they had made a mistake. Where was the treasure?
Then he says, no, 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 it's not there, and he points to an area that's underneath an oak tree, saying, there, there, can't you see it?
George Hart had lost all faith in their medium. The decision was made to return home. The next morning, Clayton still believed that the treasure was within his grasp.
He's clearly bought into this story lock, stock, and barrel, and is devoted, I think, so much of his own energy to this that he just can't accept that this is the end of the road. So without his brother, he actually then goes back to the spot, to the oak tree. But this time, instead of shovels, he brings dynamite.
In a desperate last attempt, Clayton Hart set the charge, lit the touch paper, and ran. When the air cleared, Clayton frantically started digging. But again, nothing. Thomas Beale's riches had eluded him once again. The next 4 years passed without any progress. But Clayton Hart remained as keen as ever to find Beale's lost treasure.
Clayton Hart is a true believer. He thinks that one new lead is all that it'll take for him to uncover the hidden treasure.
He returned to the Beale papers and focused in on the pamphlet's publisher, James B. Ward.
He decides to go and find out who he is. And see what he's got to say, and if he can help find the treasure.
Clayton Hart made inquiries. Who was the mysterious Mr. Ward?
Clayton Hart finds out that James Ward is indeed a real person, and he lives in Lynchburg, not that far from where they are. So he goes to try and find him.
He journeyed to Lynchburg to meet Ward. Hart recounted the brothers' adventures trying to find Beale's lost treasure and asked if Ward had any new leads.
And Ward tells Hart point blank, everything in the pamphlet I published is true. Everything that you read about the expedition and the gold and Robert Morris and the unnamed friend cracking the code, it's all true.
But Ward couldn't provide any further details. Nothing that could help Clayton find the treasure. Clayton returned to Roanoke in despair. The last living connection to the mystery had led nowhere, and the location of Beale's riches remained unknown. It was another 20 years before the Hart brothers got their next lead. George Hart was by this time a qualified lawyer, living in Washington, D.C. In 1924, he read a magazine article about a Colonel George Fabian and the work of American codebreakers during the First World War.
He was the founder of what's effectively an independent code-breaking research facility, a think tank, that was of great use to the American military in the First World War. And Hart thinks, wow, maybe Fabian's crew can crack this code.
With Clayton's blessing, George Hart mailed Colonel Fabian with the story of the brothers' adventures, together with the codes and all the information they knew about the mystery. Intrigued, Fabian wrote back to George Hart.
The problem has my interest, and I am writing in the vain hope that either you or Clayton Hart can give us further information, because the psychology of it is about all we have to go on in picking our point of attack. In the meantime, we will retain the pamphlet and work on it as we can find the time to do so.
Fabian pointed out what the Hart brothers already knew, that in order to crack the ciphers on papers 1 and 3, he first needed to discover the correct keys.
But he said, it's difficult. It's very difficult, if not impossible, to break a code in a vacuum, devoid of all context that we understand. And so in some sense, this response, which Hart hoped would really be sort of a magic key to open this lock, is simply more of what they already understood, which is that until you really know more about how this code was created, cracking it is fiendishly difficult.
Fabian's attempts to decipher the Beale papers went nowhere. He decided to enlist the talents of his 2 top cryptologists. William and Elizabeth Friedman were both accomplished codebreakers and pioneers of new cryptographic techniques born out of the First World War.
William and Elizabeth Friedman are 2 probably of the most famous code breakers in the United States. They would often look at some of these unsolved ciphers and sort of crack them for fun.
The Friedmans studied the Beale ciphers and applied their expertise to the problem of breaking them.
Freedmen's look at these ciphers and they use their toolbox. But the difference between them and other people is that William Freedman invented the toolbox. So when he and his wife look at this thing, they look with incredibly piercing vision.
The more the Freedmans looked at the Beale papers, the more they suspected they were not what they claimed to be. In a letter to Clayton Hart written in 1938, Elizabeth Freedman gave their damning verdict.
Such maps, when examined, have almost invariably proved to be forgeries, foisted upon an unsuspecting public which, thanks to the double lure of buried treasure and cryptographic form, have persisted throughout the years since they first appeared in 1885. It is likewise believed that the cryptogram, which you forwarded, is nothing more or less than a hoax.
In other words, the Freedmans were confident that the Harts had wasted their time on a wild goose chase.
It is perhaps the most crippling sort of blow to the belief of the Harts and other people that this could possibly be an actual story, an actual true story. That the code-breaking experts of the time come to the conclusion that there's no truth in this at all.
The Freedmans had no doubt that the story of Thomas Beale's treasure was a cleverly written hoax, probably created to sell pamphlets. But if it was a hoax, who had perpetrated it? One theory points the finger at a Lynchburg newspaper editor named John William Sherman.
In 1885, John William Sherman purchases the Lynchburg Virginian newspaper. Very quickly, the Lynchburg Virginian gets into financial difficulties, and Sherman, who is known as a famous writer of dime novels, strikes upon an idea that perhaps to reverse the fortunes of the Lynchburg Virginian, he should publish something that sells.
Some researchers now believe that Sherman created the Beale papers as a money spinner.
It makes a lot of sense if you think about it. He certainly had the experience and the background and had the motive in being in a difficult financial position with his newspaper.
There is another piece of evidence that supports this theory. Advertisements for the Beale papers pamphlet ran a total of 84 times from 1885, and only ever in one newspaper, the Lynchburg Virginian.
Who on earth would publish an advert 84 times? Who could afford to do that? The only person that could really do that would be the owner, John William Sherman.
And there's one more startling connection. Sherman's first cousin was none other than the man Clayton Hart had visited in 1903. The publisher of the Beale papers, James B. Ward.
John Sherman cannot publish the Beale papers under his own name. He's well known in Virginia as the editor of this newspaper, and it's known that he's also in financial difficulties. So he enlists his cousin to act as agent, James Ward, finishing the deception and authenticating the texts as true.
In other words, it seems there never was a Beale or a treasure. The whole thing was a fabrication. But Clayton Hart was convinced that the papers were real. He went to his grave, believing that Thomas Beale's treasure was out there somewhere. Despite the evidence that the Beale papers were a hoax, the mystery still continued to intrigue treasure hunters and code breakers alike. In the 1960s, a computer scientist named Carl Hammer entered the quest to decipher the mysterious Beale codes. He put the number sequences through the most advanced computers of the day. He even identified patterns in the ciphers, but still, he failed to crack the codes. In the 1980s, a historical journal from the 1820s emerged that told of a party closely fitting the description of Beale's. Was this evidence that Thomas Beale and his men really had existed? And if Beale was real, was the treasure also?
We know that Beale and his associates didn't return for the box that they had entrusted with Morris, and that Beale disappears after the 1820s. So, what happened to Thomas Beale? Did something sinister happen? Did he go and dig up the treasure himself? There are many possible outcomes in 19th century America.
One theory is that Beale and his party may have returned to retrieve their precious booty. Another is that before they could do so, they came to an untimely end. If that's the case, then Beale's treasure could still lie undiscovered. Clayton and George Hart spent 50 years of their lives trying to solve the mystery of Beale's treasure. A mystery that continues to captivate treasure hunters and code breakers to this day.
The Beale ciphers, the Beale papers, are a source of incredible interest to people, and they continue to be, even 100 years later. And they will be 200 years later, because, and I speak as a literary critic, they are so well written. I myself don't think there is treasure sitting somewhere in Virginia. I think there is a person who published an absolutely fantastic adventure story.
To those who do believe the legend, there is a fortune in gold, silver, and jewels, buried 6 feet under the Virginia soil. And finding it is simply a matter of cracking the mystery of Thomas Beale's codes.
If people just forget about the legends, if they can just look at the numbers, everything you need to know is in the numbers. For me, the Beale ciphers are crackable, but it's a mystery. It's a great mystery.
According to legend, he was Britain's greatest king.
The name of King Arthur resonates very deeply with the British.
King Arthur led his knights of the Round Table from Camelot, a vast, spectacular castle built on a hill. But was the legend of Camelot based on reality, or simply a myth?
It's a very fuzzy and vague place. It's glorious and it's glamorous.
If King Arthur really did exist, then the remains of his castle Camelot should lie buried somewhere in Britain. But where? In the 1960s, a team of archaeologists used the latest technology to try to prove the legend was real. They were led by Leslie Alcock, a brilliant, energetic showman who brought modern archaeology into the mainstream.
And in 1966,
Leslie Alcock was one of the rock and roll archaeologists of his day.
Alcock identified a hill in Somerset, close to Glastonbury, as the most likely location for Camelot. But could he really prove it was the site of King Arthur's castle? If he succeeded, it would be one of the most important archaeological discoveries of the 20th century. The man who would lay claim to Camelot was born in Manchester in 1925. As a boy, Leslie Alcock was a brilliant student, determined to better himself both mentally and physically.
Dad seems to have been full of energy and drive. I found in his cycling diaries that he used to cycle 30 miles a day before going to school in the mornings. And you see that intellectually as well.
He won a scholarship to Manchester Grammar and then another to Brasenose College, Oxford. But his education was interrupted. During the Second World War, Alcock was posted to India, where he joined the 7th Gurkha Rifles. He became fascinated by the subcontinent's history and archaeology. He learned that the past isn't just what people write in textbooks, but often something tangible, hidden in the ground. In India, he would eventually go on to work for one of Britain's most flamboyant archaeologists, Sir Mortimer Wheeler.
The story I'm telling you is not fantasy.
Wheeler's role was quite crucial in a way. One of the newspaper reporters said if he hadn't turned into a great archaeologist, he'd have been a matinee idol.
Moreover, we can relate this evidence.
He was an amazingly charismatic character.
Which, it is agreed...
It's towards the end of his active life, but nonetheless, boy, could he still carry it on. And, I mean, terrible old goat still.
Dad was invited by Sir Mortimer Wheeler to work at Mohenjo-Daro, this incredibly important dig into the centre of the Indus civilization. And I think he was taken on for a lot for his language skills, for his ability to get on with the locals, as much for his archaeological skills.
In 1946, Alcock returned to a very different Britain to the one he had left. Post-war, with its empire crumbling, the country was shattered, hungry, and in need of a lift. A country desperate for new heroes. In the early 1950s, morale was boosted by the British expedition's conquest of Everest. And Roger Bannister breaking the 4-minute mile. Reminders that Britain could still be great.
He'd obviously used up his last ounce of energy, but what an achievement for Bannister and Britain.
But there was one hero from the past people turned to more than any other.
The modern growth of Arthur is something that happened after the Second World War, when people were thinking more about national roots, how they came to be so, and so forth.
There was a resurgence of interest in the Arthurian legends, I think primarily because King Arthur was seen as a figure who'd united his country in order to fight off Germanic invaders.
King Arthur was known as the once and future king. Legend said he would rise again and restore Britain to greatness.
Part of the story is that Arthur is not really dead. He's in the Isle of Avalon, or he's in a cave of sleep, or somewhere. And the idea grew up that somehow or other Arthur would return and there would be a new golden age in Britain.
Such was the fascination with King Arthur. Post-war historians and archaeologists wanted to prove the legend was based on facts, not just myth, and that Britain's very identity was forged under the blade of the mighty king. King Arthur was supposed to have ruled in the Dark Ages, around 500 AD. He was said to have been born on the Cornish Isle of Tintagel, under the watchful eye of the wizard Merlin. The story goes that Arthur became the true king of the Britons, as only he could draw the sword Excalibur that had been set in stone. He valiantly defeated invaders who came across the sea from Europe, and in one battle, single-handedly killed 960 men.
He unified his country from warring factions. He defended it against invaders. He led a band of knights, the Knights of the Round Table, who were famous for their adventures, for finding the Holy Grail and rescuing damsels in distress.
And at the heart of the legend lies Camelot, Arthur's magnificent castle.
Sometimes it's said to have been built and designed by Merlin the magician. It's impregnable, it never falls to invaders, having several rings of walls around a central keep with great gatehouses and towers on them.
It's got to be a suitable place for a glorious king and his glorious court. So it's rich, it's towering ramparts, it's horses which are clad in marvellous armours and people in beautiful robes, all being very gracious. It's a fabulous place.
But separating the legend of Camelot from real history was almost impossible, because people weren't writing about events in Dark Age Britain. In fact, there were no history books at all. So there's no record of King Arthur or Camelot at the time. The first mention of Arthur was not until the 9th century, 300 years after he was supposed to have lived, in a book called the Historia Brittonum.
Historia Brittonum told a story about a historical Arthur who conducted a series of battles against the Anglo-Saxons and emerged from these battles as the great victor. The Arthur of Historia Brittonum isn't a king. He is given a title, Dux Bellorum, which just means the battle leader or war leader.
However, there is no mention of Camelot in the Historia Brittonum. But academics reasoned that a great war leader must have led from a great castle of some kind. Camelot the castle doesn't appear until the 12th century, when a writer called Geoffrey of Monmouth first mentions it, as well as King Arthur's magnificent Round Table. He depicted Arthur's court as a place of chivalry, where the king treated all knights as equals.
Geoffrey of Monmouth concocted his History of the Kings of Britain. This has its centrepiece, the life and career of King Arthur. It's the first place where, for example, his wife, Queen Guinevere, is mentioned, his fabulous court, his amazing weapons.
Thanks to Geoffrey of Monmouth, the legend of King Arthur and Camelot was born.
The idea that Arthur had a great castle at his court became increasingly inextricable from the legend of Arthur and his knights, who could now be seated around a round table in a magnificent castle.
But because the King Arthur of legend existed in the Dark Ages, not the Middle Ages, when the texts were written. There was no way of proving through recorded history alone that he actually lived. In fact, because recorded history was so scant, it was not until the 20th century that archaeologists began piecing together the story of Dark Age Britain, after the Romans had left, a time of supposed chaos and barbarism. The idea formed that maybe archaeology could offer answers where the history books had failed. And just maybe, the remains of King Arthur's great castle could be found, buried deep beneath the ground. It became one of the century's great quests of popular archaeology. When Leslie Alcock was growing up, one of the first to pioneer the new search for what was now being called Arthur's Britain was archaeologist Raleigh Radford. For 5 years, he excavated around the ruins of Arthur's legendary birthplace and what some believed had been his castle, the Isle of Tintagel in Cornwall. What he found were pottery fragments from half a world away. Fragments that completely contradicted notions of the Dark Ages. Incredibly, these fragments were from storage jars that once contained the luxury goods of their day, like wine and olive oil.
The importance of the Mediterranean pottery is it actually showed links with the late Roman world. To have this material suddenly coming in and recognized as being from dated contexts in the Mediterranean, it was a bolt of light.
Radford's pottery showed that rather than being chaotic, leaderless, and isolated, some Dark Age Britons were actually very different.
Raleigh Radford, with these fragments of high-status pottery, was demonstrating that far from a lapse into barbarism, a break with Rome, Roman traditions, Roman civilization and culture had still been continued by the Britons in the face of the invading Saxons.
Radford's discoveries raised the extraordinary question. If Dark Age Britons were trading in luxury goods, who would they have been destined for, if not a king or leader of some kind? Could Tintagel have been a receiving port for a leader in the west of Britain, where King Arthur supposedly reigned? Because of Radford's pioneering work, excitement grew that maybe King Arthur really had existed, and that archaeology might even turn up something with his name on it. Perhaps the mighty sword Excalibur, or the remains of the Round Table, maybe even Camelot itself. Among those profoundly influenced by Radford's discoveries was Leslie Alcock, who in the 1950s was an assistant lecturer in archaeology at Cardiff University. On his first major dig, Alcock stumbled across the Dark Ages, almost by accident.
He started digging at a site called Dinas Powys, just outside Cardiff, and he did that as a thinking that he was going to be dealing essentially with an Iron Age site.
To his great surprise, Alcock was able to prove the Iron Age hill fort at Dinas Powys had been reoccupied in the Dark Ages, 1,000 years later. Alcock's excavation sparked an interest in post-Roman Britain that would define his career. By the 1960s, he became fascinated by new technology and techniques in archaeology that he believed might get to the bottom of the King Arthur myth once and for all. And what better way to start than finding the site of Arthur's legendary castle? But in a country with dozens of claims to be the original site of Camelot, working out where to dig was the biggest challenge of all.
For Dad, archaeology started very much before the digging. And what I always found was he was always looking in what was written. So much is taking the writings, which the historical record, and trying to find out if the historical record is true, or the places talked about in the historical record, can we identify them?
By examining every mention of the castle in the hundreds of stories that have been written about King Arthur, Alcock gradually picked out the main candidates. In the Middle Ages, Geoffrey of Monmouth and the Romance writers had said that Camelot lay in Caerleon, in Wales. But that was thought to be based on the presence of a Roman amphitheatre that looked like a giant round table. Another possible candidate was found in Malory's Morte d'Arthur, published in 1485.
Sir Thomas Malory tried to ground his version of the Arthurian legends, and he's very clear that Camelot is at Winchester.
Malory's theory was based on what was thought to be King Arthur's round table, which hangs in the Great Hall in Winchester. Carbon dating has in fact shown it was made for King Edward I, 700 years after King Arthur was supposed to have existed. But it was the writings of John Leyland, antiquary to King Henry VIII, that really piqued Alcock's interest. In 1542, Leyland wrote that a hill next to the village of South Cadbury in Somerset was the location of King Arthur's Camelot.
Leyland quite specifically dismisses all other candidates for Camelot except for Cadbury. He picks up the camel name from the local village names, Queen's Camel, places like that. Leyland sees in these very steep slopes and the ramparts there and the material, he gets almost orgiastic about how marvellous and how brilliant it all is.
Leyland said generations of locals had called the hill Camelot, a fact that had even drawn the attention of Alcock's mentor in India, Sir Mortimer Wheeler.
They said that their tradition was, they'd been told by their fathers and their grandfathers, that King Arthur used to resort to this place, and it was known as Camelot or Camelot. That's the only real evidence we have, a local tradition. It's quite possible, I won't say more than that there is a little element of truth in this.
Local author Geoffrey Ashe, who had written several books on King Arthur, was so convinced that Cadbury could be Camelot, he approached Raleigh Radford, asking him to dig the site.
Cadbury is big. The enclosure at the top is 18 acres. Raleigh Radford was very much interested in Arthur, but when I asked him, could we excavate Cadbury, his response was, it's too big, I wouldn't know where to start.
But then Radford changed his mind, thanks to the findings of a dog walker on the hill at Cadbury, Mary Harefield.
She would go up there to walk her dog. The dog's name was Caesar. And she would walk about in ploughed-up fields there and poke about with the ferrule of an umbrella, which is the most elementary form of archaeology.
Mary Harefield turned up fragments of pottery that she thought was unusual and presented it to Raleigh Radford.
Mary Harefield's fragments were almost identical to Radford's finds at Tintagel.
Raleigh Radford, who had a vast experience of excavation throughout the West Country, immediately recognised as what he called Tintagel ware. High-status tableware, high-status storage jars, fragments, from the Eastern Mediterranean.
So oil, wine and other luxuries had been sent up from Tintagel to Cadbury for someone of high status, exactly at the time that King Arthur was supposed to have lived. And these weren't the only clues that made Alcock and Radford want to excavate what could have been King Arthur's castle. Cadbury had clearly been fortified at some time, its banks ridged with earthen ramparts, possibly to protect a large army, just as Arthur was supposed to have led. And it was located just 11 miles from Glastonbury, with its Arthurian associations, and would have been on the front line in battles with invading Anglo-Saxons pushing west. Even the Ordnance Survey map used to call it Camelot. Radford, Alcock and Wheeler staked their reputations on discovering Camelot at Cadbury. Failure to find it wasn't an option. In 1965, the Camelot Research Committee sat for the first time, tasked with the excavation of South Cadbury. Sir Mortimer Wheeler agreed to be president, offering advice from afar. Wheeler compared their quest to the late 19th century discovery of an ancient city, also thought to be entirely fictitious, until archaeology had proved otherwise.
One of the things which Sir Mortimer Wheeler was very, very keen to stress was that it was possible for archaeologists to discover legendary locations. He said if Heinrich Schliemann could find Troy, then why shouldn't English archaeologists be able to find Camelot?
The man who had started the search for King Arthur at Tintagel, Raleigh Radford, was the committee's chairman. The last surviving member of the committee today is Arthurian author Geoffrey Ashe.
Well, I was co-founder and I was secretary. I was the one who wasn't actually an archaeologist. I kept the minutes and things like that and handled the correspondence.
Leslie Alcock was the final committee member, selected as the outstanding Dark Age archaeologist of the day.
Leslie, because of his reputation as an excavator and his knowledge because of Dinas Powys, as well as his wider archaeological knowledge, was invited to come on board and appointed as Director of Excavations.
Unlike Radford, Alcock was undaunted by the scale of Cadbury.
I think it was the challenge of South Cadbury, which is what appealed to Leslie. It's a time of big projects. The BBC were digging Silbury Hill for the first time, and South Cadbury was going to be, if he got the money, a big project.
But on a hilltop of 18 acres, working out just where to start digging was in many ways more of a challenge than digging itself. Alcock was pioneering in his early use of geophysical surveying in deciding where to excavate.
It's often said that Leslie Alcock was one of the rock and roll archaeologists of his day. He was actually at the cutting edge of the white heat of technology. He used every technological means at his disposal to make sure that when they finally got picks and shovels out, they were digging in the right place.
Guy Morgan Evans was a young supervisor on the search for Camelot, who was tasked with using the new technology.
One of the clinches there was the use of what became called the soil anomaly detector, and rather than calling it SAD, it was called the banjo.
17.
It looked like a banjo. It had a round disc at one end and a box at the other, connected by a long metal pole.
25.
What you had to do is you laid out 20-metre grids and you walked along calling out measurements at every few intervals.
31.
These were then written down by somebody. It became really repetitive, boring. It was awful.
But it wasn't just advanced technology Alcock deployed to work out where to dig. He was prepared to humour some of Geoffrey Ash's New Age beliefs.
I use dowsing, sometimes called water divining, but it needn't be only water. It can detect other things. Leslie very generously allowed me to do it. Now, I think this was brave of him because we were working with the media breathing down our necks, and it could so easily have been made ridiculous to say that they're digging with dowsing rods.
Back at base, Alcock began to analyse the data from his geophysical surveys. He could tell the site was originally Iron Age, but could it have been reoccupied and refortified at the time of King Arthur? The banjo readings seemed to suggest so. There was only one way to know for sure.
When you're faced with a mass of preliminary evidence, there's only one way to resolve the problems and to sort it out, and that's to excavate.
But a dig of this scale needed a lot of money. The Camelot Research Committee had to somehow raise £15,000 to finance the excavation, the equivalent to almost £250,000 today. However, the committee knew just using the very word Camelot was guaranteed to get people's attention. In America, Camelot the musical had been the biggest show on Broadway. President Kennedy's Inner Circle had been named after Camelot. The name Camelot was on everyone's lips, capturing imaginations on both sides of the Atlantic.
Using the name Camelot was incredibly significant. Leslie Alcock was very keen to popularise archaeology, and the idea of King Arthur and Camelot might lead to an appreciation of history in these dark ages was important to him as a democratic way of explaining to beyond the elite of academia exactly what he was digging up.
With donations from the BBC, the Pilgrims Trust in America, and an exclusive deal with the Observer newspaper, finally the committee raised enough to begin the dig. But none of the archaeologists knew that one of the committee had personally taken a huge financial risk to ensure the excavation could proceed.
We were aware of the money constraints we had to spend. Leslie at times would get very twitchy, which doesn't surprise me because I only learnt later on that he, at one stage, he'd actually put up his house as security.
Leslie Alcock was a brilliant manager, a brilliant organiser. And considering the troubles he was up against, he was a very courageous man.
The dig for Camelot took place on the top of the hill and on the southern side, where a major trench was dug from top to bottom.
It was a time of really quite high tension because there was a need to deliver. It was a funny mixture of excitement, tension, and it used to come away absolutely wrung out and feeling like a wet dishcloth at the end of it.
Alcock's team catalogued all their discoveries. And hopes were dramatically raised when someone found an artifact in the shape of a letter.
All the letters it had to be in the alphabet, it was the letter A, and that, of course, caused huge excitement at the time.
The A had to stand for Arthur, surely proof of Cadbury's claims to Camelot. Alcock was so pleased with the find, he persuaded Sir Mortimer Wheeler to come and see Arthur's brooch. But after careful analysis, the A is discovered to be a Roman brooch, dating from before the Dark Ages. It couldn't possibly be Arthurian. Despite the setback, Alcock's team pressed on, their morale boosted by regular appearances of Sir Mortimer Wheeler.
He said to Leslie Alcock, "Dig there." Alcock dutifully did dig there and found things. Sir Mortimer was quite right, but he had an instinct by then, you know.
Alcock's other great mentor and collaborator, Raleigh Radford, would regularly visit the dig to check on developments.
Radford was sort of almost an amateur archaeologist in his own way, as a gentleman of independent means, although he was taken very seriously in some ways.
Raleigh Radford was an inspiration to a whole succeeding generation of archaeologists, and not surprisingly, Leslie Alcock started digging at a lot of the sites that Raleigh Radford had first drawn people's attention to.
Another regular visitor to the site was Alcock's son, John.
I think South Cadbury was just very special. When you looked at the side of a trench, you're talking layer after layer of history. There's my dad standing beside saying to me, well, that's the medieval layer, that's the Dark Age layer.
The dig for Camelot was getting huge publicity. After 6 weeks of excavations, Alcock appeared on the BBC to explain their progress.
Well, we've now reached the end of our work in 1966, and both the traces of buildings that we've found and the finds particularly give us every reason to believe that we've got a good site here of the 6th century AD in particular.
By now, interest in the dig had spread beyond Britain. Alcock needed to raise more money for further excavations and was given a huge boost by an unexpected source.
One evening, I was at home, the telephone rang, I picked it up, and the voice said, "This is Warner Brothers, where was Camelot?"
Camelot, the Broadway musical, was being turned into a major motion picture, starring Richard Harris and Vanessa Redgrave.
They wanted this for the film, you see. They were going to put a map in the film. So I said, it was in Somerset. Well, of course I said that. That's my one contribution to Hollywood.
For Leslie Alcock, Hollywood's interest was another great marketing opportunity.
You're talking about a time when Camelot had come out, when the Arthurian legend was a fascination to everyone, and my dad saw that by pushing that side of it, that this could be Camelot, he would get money to do the serious excavation. And what's more, by going to America, he could tap into a much bigger market with more money.
In the summer of 1967, the search for Camelot started up again. Thanks to the film, the committee raised enough funds, principally from America, to continue digging for another 3 summers.
Well, it's the time when flowers are coming from San Francisco. You've got Sgt. Pepper and Lowly Heart Club Band. It's sort of the hippie era. It was all high degree of interest, and with the television cameras and the newspapers, and that it was all very, very buzzy.
The dig for Camelot went on for a further 3 years. As it drew to a close in 1970, Alcock made 2 extraordinary breakthroughs. His team found a late Roman coin of Dark Age origin, buried in the fortifications, that proved that the ramparts dated almost exactly to the time Arthur was supposed to have existed.
The eureka moment, if you like, where they realised that there was some substance to the legends which had got them digging, was discovering this wasn't only an Iron Age Celtic site that maybe some Saxons had lived on top of, but in the actual Arthurian period had been fortified, had been turned into an actual castle.
And if it was a Dark Age castle, who was to say it couldn't be Camelot? But then Alcock made an even more remarkable discovery: the remains of a great hall. A hall littered with Dark Age pot shards, almost certainly used for banqueting by a great ruler at the time of King Arthur. Maybe even Arthur himself.
At South Cadbury, there was a gigantic hall, a hall at least 20 feet across, that could easily have fitted something of the size and scale of the Round Table at Winchester, for example.
It was proof, surely, that Camelot lay at South Cadbury.
Here was my dad saying, actually, I'm the guy with the physical evidence. I've got the great big hall. You know, I've got something that is far more likely to be Arthur's Camelot than anything anyone else has found.
If the castle was surrounded by Dark Age fortifications and contained a great leader's feasting hall, it seemed King Arthur really could have ruled from Cadbury.
Are you yourself convinced that these were the defences of King Arthur himself?
Well, in my most cautious mood, I would only go this far to say that if it isn't Arthur himself, then it's another great military leader so like him that it doesn't make tons of difference.
Alcock and his team were triumphant. They basked in the knowledge that they had shown the legend of King Arthur and Camelot to be real after all. Little by little, doubts about the dig at Cadbury started to emerge. Academics began to question Alcock's methods and his evidence.
There's nothing at South Cadbury which would make one believe that there was an Arthur in the 6th century than one did without it. In terms of finding evidence for a historical Arthur, it completely failed.
Every generation of archaeologists challenges those that went before it. They challenge their assumptions and they challenge their findings. That's the discipline of archaeology.
Believing that a war leader called Arthur led the Britons in their heroic defeat of the Anglo-Saxons in the 6th century is akin to believing that an Englishman in a dinner jacket called James Bond defeated the Soviet Union in the late 20th century.
The evidence for King Arthur's Great Hall on Cadbury was highly dubious at best, they said. It wasn't big enough for a round table at all.
It gets called the Great Hall, but to be honest, it's actually quite a small hall. An awful lot is placed on the shoulders of a really rather modest building.
Not only was there no archaeological evidence, even the historical texts which Alcock had based his research on were questionable, to say the least. The new skeptics dismantled the written foundation stone of Alcock's Arthurian claims. Rather than being a history, they said, the Historia Brittonum, which first mentioned Arthur, was a work of 9th century propaganda and had its chronology of the Dark Ages all wrong.
David Dunville's work in the 1970s completely discredited most of the evidence that Alcock and others supporting the idea of a historical Arthur had used. Obviously, this had a pretty negative impact on the credibility of Alcock's work.
Some hinted that Alcock had committed historical heresy. He had tried to give credibility to works of fiction rather than establish the truth. Even the very idea of Arthur, the heroic Briton, battling invading Anglo-Saxons was misconceived, they said.
Since the 1970s, the relationship between the Anglo-Saxons and the Britons has been increasingly reassessed, and we would now tend to think of that relationship as much more complicated and nuanced, if you like. Instead of continuous warfare and hostility, some Britons and some Anglo-Saxons lived peacefully side by side.
By the end of the 1990s, no serious historian dared associate the Dark Ages with a real King Arthur again, including Alcock himself. He had the great sense, rare among myth hunters, to accept that he was probably wrong.
I'm not aware of my dad taking criticisms hard. He always saw there was another argument. He always had some doubts as to whether Arthur existed. He always was prepared to accept there were other sides to the argument.
Despite his mistakes at Cadbury, in 1973, Alcock became the first professor of archaeology at Glasgow University and excavated Dark Age hill forts in Scotland with huge success. Alcock's legacy was not only furthering our understanding of Dark Age Britain, but also the lasting impact he had on the archaeologists he taught.
Without a doubt, Alcock's work encouraged an interest in Dark Age archaeology among a succeeding generation of archaeologists, most of whom are active today.
Leslie was a great teacher, a great academic, and I think he deserves more recognition than probably he gets. And I think in due course his contributions will be fully recognised, not least amongst the hundreds of students that he trained and sent out into the archaeological world.
You can't underestimate Leslie Alcock's contribution to the world of archaeology. This was a remarkable step change in the way that archaeology and the public interacted, and it's a legacy that we're still living under.
As for South Cadbury, the hill fort is now barely even signposted. Home just to cows and walkers, its association with King Arthur, once again, buried deep beneath the ground. And although he may not have found Camelot, Alcock had discovered the fortified remains of a great leader.
We certainly didn't find the Camelot of romance as you found it in the Middle Ages. We did find that the hill had been a great fortified place at exactly the right time.
And we now know South Cadbury Hill Fort was one of Britain's largest and most significant ancient settlements, occupied for 4,000 years, from Neolithic times until the Middle Ages.
Leslie Alcock's excavation at South Cadbury was, in many ways, a great success. It found an outstandingly useful sequence of occupation from a British hill fort.
And where does that leave the legend of King Arthur? Was he just a myth, after all?
I personally think that Arthur did exist, that as a Dux Bellorum he was a great military leader. Where he was, when he was, I can't be sure.
I think we can say that there was a real person. He is called King of the Britons.
Every nation needs its foundation myth, and Britain's is the legend of King Arthur and Camelot, a legend that lives on. In the early 19th century, stories emerged of mysterious ruins that lay buried and forgotten deep inside the jungles of Central America. But a lost civilization in this region was thought to be impossible in the 1800s. Everyone knew that the continent had only ever been peopled by savages. But they couldn't have created such sophisticated structures. Someone else must have done it.
So Egyptians or Asians had come to Central America and built these ruins and then left again.
But then an American lawyer named John Lloyd Stevens and a British artist, Frederick Catherwood, went to see these ruins for themselves.
An artist and a lawyer go into a jungle. I mean, how more preposterous can it be?
They traveled hundreds of miles through the jungles of Mexico, Guatemala, and Honduras to search for the ruins. Eventually, they uncovered the remains of 44 cities.
It was extraordinarily exciting for them because they knew they'd found something the world had never seen before.
With their astonishing discoveries, the two amateur explorers overturned everything we thought we knew about the history of the New World. This is the amazing story of how Stevens and Catherwood discovered one of the world's greatest civilizations, the Maya. John Lloyd Stevens was born to a prosperous New Jersey family in 1805. He was classically educated, a trained lawyer, and a rising Democratic Party politician. And so he might have remained, but for a chance event. During a mayoral campaign in 1834, Stevens's voice became so hoarse with public speaking that he developed a serious throat infection. His doctor advised an immediate change of climate. Stevens took his doctor at his word. He enjoyed the thrill of traveling around Europe and the Middle East, writing about his adventures amongst the ruins of the Old World.
By the mid-1830s, he goes to Egypt and the Holy Land. He travels to Greece and Poland and Russia, and he really takes to it. He seems to have a real talent for travel writing.
On his way back to New York, Stevens stopped off in London in 1836. Here, he met Frederick Catherwood, a well-known British artist.
Catherwood was trained as an architect to begin with, so he understands buildings, he understands structure. And then he goes to the Royal Academy schools in London and trains as an artist.
Catherwood studied under some of the greatest masters of his time. Turner gave him lessons on perspective. Others taught him how to draw buildings, and Catherwood became a highly accomplished architectural painter. Like Stevens, Catherwood had traveled to many of the great ruins of Europe and the Middle East between 1821 and 1832.
Stevens and Catherwood acquired, really, very extensive knowledge, both of them, of the kind of archaeology that was known about at that time in the Old World.
While Stevens had written about these ancient worlds, Catherwood had painted their ruins in great detail. But then, Stevens and Catherwood would hear rumors of a New World civilization, which would define the path they would follow for the rest of their lives.
They come together and discuss what is just about on the radar at the time, and this is these curious remnants of some sort of ancient civilization in Central America.
Catherwood showed Stevens an intriguing book called Descriptions of an Ancient City. Published in 1822, it displayed illustrations of ruins with palaces and pyramids covered with characters and symbols in a mysterious place called Palenque in southern Mexico.
Catherwood showed him a series of books. One of them provided quite an avid description of Palenque, but had decided that, like so many scholars of the time, that it couldn't have been the native Indians that had created these ruins.
The idea that there had ever been a Native American civilization deep in the jungles of Central America was unthinkable to many in the 1800s.
Indigenous Indians could not have built these ruins, could not have built such great palaces, and they were magnificent palaces for a culture that never moved beyond stone tools.
Indians, according to historians of the day, were thought to be savage and primitive, and not capable of building such sophisticated cities. The view was that the ruins at Palenque must have been the work of other cultures.
They must have been an ancient culture from across the sea. So Egyptians or Asians had come to Central America and built these ruins and then left again.
The reason for this view was that historians had very fixed ideas. Critically, they believed all civilizations had to conform to a certain set of rules.
In the 1830s, I mean, Stevens and Catherwood, when talking about civilization, would define it in terms of cities and impressive-looking architecture. Evidence of rulers and rule, complex kind of agricultural systems, a writing system.
And then there is time for people to be artists, to sculpt monuments, to study the sciences, travel, trade, have a wealth of goods, have teachers, schools.
Everyone agreed that the primitive nomadic people of Central America couldn't have achieved anything like this. Though they weren't professional historians, Stevens and Catherwood believed that those who held that view were wrong. They could see no evidence that Egyptians and Phoenicians had ever been to Central America, and the images they were looking at were very different to anything they had seen in the Old World. They must have been made by an unknown Native American culture.
Stevens and Catherwood were extraordinarily different people. I mean, that's what makes them so marvellous as a pair. This is a sort of Holmes and Watson, you know, of Maya archaeology. They could see that was evident in the New World was something very, very different.
He and Catherwood together were the first to look at these sites without the filters of thinking about Old World archaeology. Both are very much interested in these being indigenously authored sites.
These illustrations and vague accounts of a lost city aroused Stevens and Catherwood's curiosity. They decided to look further. Two years later, in 1838, Stevens got another lead. A New York bookseller showed him several more works relating to ruins in Central America. One was a large folio based on the personal explorations and illustrations of French archaeologist Jean-Frédéric Waldeck, which had just been published in Paris. These pages showed again the illustrations of the Palenque ruins in Mexico, first made known to Stevens by Catherwood. And there was more. The book also revealed illustrations of another strange ruin in Uxmal, in the Yucatan region of Mexico. Stevens then learned from the bookseller that yet a further set of ruins were said to exist in an area called Copan, in modern-day Honduras.
Stevens had read an account by a man called Juan Galindo, who'd actually been to Copan and written a description of what he'd seen there.
Monstrous figures are found among the ruins. One, a colossal alligator, having in its jaws a figure with a human face, but with the paws of an animal.
Stevens was stunned. He had now heard of 3 separate ruined cities. Palenque in southern Mexico, Uxmal in the Yucatan, and Copan in Honduras, all in the same region, but hundreds of miles apart. And who knew if there were any more? Stevens began to wonder, could these ruins be evidence that there had once been a great civilization in that region?
He is, among the first of these explorer writers to begin connecting the dots and thinking about this as a coherent civilization.
Stevens could see that there must be some connection between these ruins. And these weren't just one palace here and one palace there, completely different groups. There must have been something between them.
Back at home, Stevens became convinced he was onto something and was determined to find these 3 ruins he'd learned about: Palenque, Uxmal, and Copan. He began to plan an expedition to Central America. Because Stevens was now earning substantial royalties from his successful travel books, he invited his artist friend, Frederick Catherwood, to go with him. Stevens sent him word to get ready. The deal meant that Catherwood would illustrate any ruins they find in Central America, and Stevens would pay for it. Catherwood packed his brushes, paints, and reams of paper. He also packed machetes and pistols, as there was a real chance of trouble where they were going. British Honduras and Guatemala were in the middle of a violent border dispute, and the area was considered a very dangerous place to visit. Stevens realized that they were going to need all the help they could get. He persuaded the US President, Martin Van Buren, to appoint him as a special ambassador to Central America to help ease their way through the unstable region.
He's even given a special sort of frock coat to wear for the sort of official occasions. So he has that diplomatic mission which runs alongside the artistic and historical mission.
The only problem was, the 4 previous US ambassadors to have held this position had all died in office in Central America. Stevens received a letter from one of their widows, whose husband had died of malaria. It concluded with the ominous words, "May you be more fortunate than any of your predecessors have been." Stevens and Catherwood left New York on the 3rd of October, 1839, determined to locate the 3 ruins buried deep in the jungles of Central America. After a month at sea, the 2 explorers arrived in Belize, on the northeastern coast of Central America. Their plan was to first head towards one of the mysterious lost cities Stevens had heard about in New York. It was called Copan, and it lay in the western region of Honduras, close to the Guatemalan border. In honor of Stevens' diplomatic position, they were guests of the British governor in Belize, Colonel MacDonald, a veteran of the Napoleonic Wars. MacDonald warned them they were entering dangerous country, and his diplomatic pass would hold no sway with any rebel forces they may encounter. MacDonald put Stevens and Catherwood on a government steamboat and told them that if danger did threaten, they were to hang out their flag and send word to him. Then he sent them on their way with a 13-gun salute. Undaunted, they arrived on the coast of eastern Guatemala the following morning. Now the two explorers had to climb over the Mico mountain range to reach the Guatemalan border with Honduras. Once there, they would enter Honduras and go on to Copan. Stevens hired a guide who was fluent in Spanish and knew the grueling mountain pass that loomed ahead. Although only just over 4,000 feet, Mico Mountain was a treacherous route to cross. Stevens later described their experience in his book of the expedition, Incidents of Travel in Central America.
For 5 long hours, we were dragged through mud holes, squeezed in gullies, knocked against trees, and tumbled over roots. Every step required care and great physical exertion. I felt that our inglorious epitaph might be tossed over the head of a mule, brained by the trunk of a mahogany tree, and buried in the mud of Mico Mountain.
Catherwood looked at Stevens and groaned.
If I'd known of this cursed Mico Mountain before I agreed to come, you would have come to Central America alone.
Here's a guy in a jungle with guns on each hip and a sword, and in all likelihood wearing shades because he suffered from eye problems, inflammation of the iris, and there's a reference to him wearing spectacles. I mean, that picture, when you think about it, I mean, Keith Richards got nothing on that.
Over the next 2 weeks, the party hacked through jungles and traversed perilous ravines.
It was jungle, end-to-end jungle, with no roads or places to stop off for the night. Food was a big issue. It seemed like they lived on chocolate and cigars most of the time.
They passed hillsides with grazing cattle that reminded Stevens of rural England, were hounded by biting insects and tropical fevers. And there was also the ever-present threat of running into ruthless rebels.
People get very nasty in civil wars, and the factions were already known to have committed atrocities and massacres and whatnot, and they had a very real suspicion of foreigners.
One evening, Stevens and Catherwood set up camp in an abandoned church. As they slept, drunken soldiers burst in, brandishing swords and muskets. Stevens recalled this incident in his account of the expedition.
Here we were in the hands of men who would have been turned out of any decent state prison lest they should contaminate the other inmates. Their appearance was ferocious, and doubtless, if we had attempted to escape, they would have been glad of the excuse for murder.
Luckily, the following morning, the soldiers had sobered up. Stevens and Catherwood were allowed to continue their journey to Copan. "14 days after arriving in Belize, the two men finally reached the area of Copan, a remote jungle region, little known by locals and rarely visited by travelers. As the two explorers worked their way through the dense forest, they suddenly came to a bank of a river. Across the water, Stephen's eyes fell on a large stone wall rising out of the undergrowth. It was 100 feet high and covered in thick, constricting vines.
It had more the character of a structure than anything we had ever seen ascribed to the Aborigines of America.
Stevens and Catherwood crossed the river to investigate. Stevens would vividly describe their experience of Copan and how they first set eyes on the ruins in his book of the expedition.
I am entering abruptly a new world. It is impossible to describe the interest with which I explored these ruins. The ground was entirely new. There were no guidebooks or guides. The whole was a virgin soil. We could not see 10 yards before us and never knew what we should stumble upon next.
Stevens realized they had to clear the ruins of its tangle of jungle vines before they could really understand what lay beneath them. Just as they were about to begin, they had an unexpected problem. The local landowner appeared. Stevens explained he wanted to clear and explore the ruins and offered to buy the land.
When his host is sort of balking at the idea, the first thing that Stevens does is he opens up his trunk, pulls out his diplomatic, sort of uniform, and claims that his host was overwhelmed by his shiny, American Eagle buttons.
At last, Stevens' diplomatic status became useful. He was allowed to purchase the Copan land for $50. Now, they could set to work. The following morning, the systematic clearing of the Copan ruins began.
Copan was extraordinarily overgrown at this point, so they were seeing little bits and pieces of Copan at a time.
At one time, we stopped to cut away branches and vines, which concealed the face of a monument, and dig around and bring to light a fragment, a sculptured corner of which protruded from the earth.
It'd be like finding one statue in Egypt and not knowing yet that the pyramids were there.
We go now and we travel there now, and they look very clinical almost, because they're very nicely cut lawns and all of the trees have been taken away. But they would have seen them thoroughly immersed in jungle.
I leaned over with breathless anxiety. An eye, an ear, a foot, or a hand was disentombed. And when the machete rang against the chiseled stone, I cleared out the loose earth with my hands.
As Stevens ran the excavations, Catherwood set up his station in the jungle to record the mysterious structures they were discovering. He used a piece of equipment called a camera lucida to help him detail what he was seeing with great accuracy.
He had with him this apparatus, the camera lucida. The light came through a kind of prism and gave you an image which you could see on a piece of paper, and you could pretty much sketch it or trace it. And it was a great help to Catherwood.
Catherwood, with his incredible knowledge of architecture, must have realized right away that this was something quite unique and that he was in a unique place, qualified to record it.
As Stevens and Catherwood gradually cleared away the jungle vines, they began to unearth evidence of a very sophisticated society.
They saw fantastic little elements of sculpture which intrigued them. And then eventually, as they carried on, they began to see these very large, great big monoliths. Seeing these, which clearly convinced them that this was something, they'd never seen anything like that before.
Working our way through the thick woods, we came upon a square stone column, about 14 feet high and 3 feet on each side from the base to the top. The front was the figure of the man, curiously and richly dressed, and the face evidently a portrait. Our guide called it an idol. And before it was a large block of stone sculptured with figures, which he called an altar. The sight of this unexpected monument gave us the assurance that the objects we were in search of were interesting, not only as the remains of an unknown people, but as works of art, proving that the people who once occupied the continent of America were not savages.
Right away, you can see how open he is, because he doesn't say, oh, that's a monster or a crude representation of the devil or something. He observes that they're very complex, must have been made by very talented people.
As the days passed, Stevens and Catherwood uncovered monumental structures that could have housed hundreds of people, and building blocks that showed all the hallmarks of a great civilization. They found large squares, terraces, and platforms with stepped pyramids, temples, ceremonial buildings, and shrines with altars.
We reached a terrace so overgrown with trees that at first we could not make out its form, but which, on clearing, we ascertained to be a square, and with steps on all the sides, as perfect as those of the Roman amphitheater.
I think they really were kind of astounded once they got to Copan, the extent of the cities.
The beauty of the sculpture, the desolation of the city, and the mystery that hung over it, all created an interest higher, if possible, than I'd ever felt among the ruins of the old world.
What is amazingly sort of human and endearing of him is the way he puts it, is that he says, after a time, looking at these things, it was evident these weren't the monuments of savages. These are sophisticated people.
Now, there could be no doubt. The two amateur men had found what professional historians had said could not exist. Proof that some form of civilization had once thrived in this area. And then came something even more extraordinary. Writing. Standing at the center of the ruins, their eyes fixed on a large stone monument with 16 seated human figures carved around it and 36 blocks of hieroglyphs on its top.
Catherwood knew from seeing all the Egyptian hieroglyphs that he'd drawn over and over again along the Nile that this was a writing system. And that the writing system, they talked together about this, probably had something to do with the images on the front.
As Stevens and Catherwood's eyes examined the hieroglyphs, they were aware that all the great cultures of the past had developed their own writing systems. The people of Copan had clearly done the same, just like the civilizations of the old world.
There were no associations connected with the place. None of those stirring recollections which hallow Rome, Athens, and the world's great mistress on the Egypt plain. But architecture, sculpture, and painting, all the arts which embellish life, had flourished in this overgrown forest. Orators, warriors, and statesmen, beauty, ambition, and glory had lived and passed away.
But it begged the question, who had built this place, and what had become of them?
The city was desolate. It lay before us like a shattered bark amidst the ocean, her masts gone, her name effaced, her crew perished, and none to tell whence she came, to whom she belonged, how long at her voyage, or what caused her destruction. In the ruined cities of Egypt, even in the long-lost Petra, the stranger knows the story of the vestiges around him.
Stevens was convinced the answer to who had built this civilization had to lie in the hieroglyphs. One day, when someone could read them, they would be able to understand the history of those who had lived here.
In regards to the age of this desolate city, I shall not at present offer any conjecture. One thing I believe, that its history is graven on its monuments.
Stevens really believed that these were historical documents, that they weren't simply, say, astronomical observations, that they're the stories of real people's lives.
Spurred on by their amazing discovery at Copan, Stevens and Catherwood continued their trek across Central America in search of other ruins.
They know that somewhere out there there's this palenque, and they've seen illustrations of that. So they were maybe already considering, well, maybe there's a very large area here. We don't know how it's constructed, whether it's an empire, whether these are kind of city-states, There was something definably similar across a wide area.
Over the next 2 years, they explored a vast region and traveled through Honduras, Guatemala, and the Yucatan in southeastern Mexico. Stevens and Catherwood uncovered, surveyed, and recorded another 43 ruined cities that had lain buried and forgotten for hundreds of years, including Uxmal, Palenque, Chichen Itza, and Tulum. And they found evidence of everything that people believed was needed for a civilization. Vast cities with central areas containing grand plazas, royal courts, and governors' palaces, proof of a sophisticated social hierarchy. Ornate temples, stepped pyramids, and monuments bearing hieroglyphic descriptions, proof of an organized religion. Gymnasiums and ball courts, astronomical observatories, intensive farming land, markets and trading centers, outlying villages, lookout towers and defensive walls with linking roads and causeways. All with a common architectural style that confirmed that there was once a single vast civilization here. Stevens and Catherwood returned to New York in the spring of 1842. They faced a new challenge. They had to convince the world that what they had discovered in Central America was truly groundbreaking. There really was a vast civilization that had once existed and thrived in a place where nobody believed there could be one. Stevens decided the best way to achieve this would be to publish a written, illustrated record of their expeditions. His first book, Incidents of Travel in Central America, came out in 1841 and was quickly followed by Incidents of Travel in Yucatan in 1843. Stevens' books contained over 200 Catherwood engravings and were an instant success, selling more than 20,000 copies within the first 3 months.
His volumes were really within the reach of the middle-class American reading public. And so the ruins reached a far wider audience than they ever had before.
Edgar Allan Poe called Stevens' work perhaps the most thrilling book on travel ever published. Catherwood then released his own volume, Views of Ancient Monuments in Central America, the following year. It documented their spectacular discoveries with 25 stunning hand-colored lithographs, which vividly brought the beautiful carved monuments, temples, and pyramids back to life.
What Catherwood did with his drawings was not so much just make pictures. He used the word draw in its larger sense of pulling. He pulled, basically drew an entire civilization out of the past into the present.
I think that there is a real parallel between Catherwood's painstaking illustration of every inch of a monument, and Stephens doing the same thing in prose.
Together, the writings of Stephens and the illustrations of Catherwood would captivate the imagination of their readers.
Stephen had a fantastic rhetoric. His writing style was clear, descriptive, immersive, and he really portrayed a lot of his passion for what he was doing through his writing.
It was a perfect example of how the words and the images complemented one another. Neither one could have pulled this off on their own.
But for all their extraordinary revelations, there was still one question they could not answer. As Stephens wrote,
I now bid farewell to the ruins. I leave them with all mystery around them, and in the feeble hope that these imperfect pages may in some way throw a glimmer of light upon the great and long vainly mooted question: who were the peoplers of America?
Stephens and Catherwood would never know the answer. They both died early in their lives. Stephens from malaria at the age of 47, and Catherwood drowned when his ship sank crossing the Atlantic in 1854. He was 55. But eventually, Stephens' prediction would come true. When someone could read their hieroglyphic descriptions, they would understand who these people were. Over the next 170 years, the secrets of this culture's history were indeed proved to be in their writing.
Stephens is really the first Western explorer in Central America and Mexico, both to believe in indigenous authorship of the ruins and to glean the importance of the glyphs.
Archaeologists, inspired by Stephens and Catherwood's explorations, managed to read the writings and the images, and a picture emerged of the rise and fall of one of the world's greatest civilizations, the Maya. The earliest traces of their existence go back to 1500 BC, and possibly as far as 2500 BC. Their kingdoms stretched across a vast area of Central America, from southern Mexico to the Atlantic and the Caribbean coast of Belize. Stephens and Catherwood's first discovery, Copan, was established in 450 AD and lasted for 400 years. With 20,000 people in an area of 100 square miles, it was the Athens of Central America from the 5th to the 9th centuries AD, at a time when Europe was lost in the Dark Ages. Copan, by any standards, was a highly developed and advanced civilization.
The Maya were a hugely sophisticated society and culture. They had a very complicated mathematics system. They were one of the few ancient groups to use the concept of zero, which is hugely important for mathematics. They had very detailed astronomy. They knew the movements of the planets and stars. They mapped the movement of Venus, for example, with a great amount of detail. Their calendar was very, very accurate, more accurate in many ways than Western calendars of a similar period. They managed to build these temples without the use of metal tools. They had very little metalwork, other than gold and silver for decorative purposes. They never had the wheel. They didn't have pack animals. There was no horses or carts or anything like that. But they were able to create temples as large, if not larger, than those in Egypt.
Stevens and Catherwood's revelation that a mighty Maya civilization lay buried in the Central American jungle was one of the greatest discoveries of their age.
An artist and a lawyer go into a jungle. I mean, that's what, how more preposterous can it be? But the thing was, the very different personalities with that overlap produced this amazing scope, which would never have happened if they hadn't been that different.
Stevens and Catherwood proved that you didn't need to be a professional academic to be a great historian. What you needed was passion, an attention to detail, and an open mind.
I think, essentially in finally judging their achievement, you have these two people that complement each other wonderfully well, with this extraordinarily vivid text and the marvelous illustrations. And what you do have here, you have two people that have established the study of the Maya.
It was remarkable, not just an intellectual achievement. It was a feat of endurance. These were heroes. They produced a remarkable event under life-threatening circumstances. I think it was one of the great exploratory triumphs, absolutely, in history.
With their astonishing discoveries, the two amateur explorers overturned every prejudice we had about the development of cultures in the New World. Stevens and Catherwood had proved beyond doubt Native Americans had constructed a sophisticated civilization that compared to any of the finest ancient civilizations of the Old World.